The morally courageous leader. We propose that without moral courage, your leadership will not be great, potentially quite the opposite. So, what is moral courage in a few moments here? Moral courage is the ability to decide with conviction and implement with compassion. So, morally courageous leaders are able to decide well, clearly, with conviction and implement with compassion. What are some of the elements that makes this work? Well, we encountered this idea whilst working with the Centre for Army Leadership a few years ago at the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst. And they've really delved into this idea of moral courage. And they describe how a morally courageous leader, for example, is very self-aware around what motivates them to act, what inhibits them from acting, what are the ideas and beliefs that are preventing me from acting. They'll consider the risks to them and whether they're the best person to take the stand that they're poised to take. And really crucially, whether they're prepared to endure consequences from those actions. The beginnings of courage begin with, I guess, consequences and understanding that there's likely to be an impact. We go further to say that without some risk, without some potential for consequence, there probably is no courage. It's just easy otherwise. So let's spend a few moments thinking about what creates great conditions for a high conviction decision first, and then perhaps explore compassion and blend the two together to give you some ideas for your leadership. The first idea around high conviction is this: high conviction decisions are rooted in the blend of vision for the future, a compelling vision for the future, and your personal values. In other words, you've got to have an idea about how your activity, your energy, your choices are going to move you towards a far better place in the future. And that better place can't just be about a few extra pounds in your pocket. So do you have an idea about how your work, your effort, your energy contributes to making the world a better place in some way, shape, or form, even if it's just for one other person? How is your work, your effort making the world a better place? Perhaps you're contributing to healthcare. Perhaps you're contributing to education. Perhaps you're providing great work for other people. Perhaps you're involved in the environment and much more. But if you don't have a clear picture about how your work is making other people's lives better, you're not going to be able to anywhere near as easily to make a high conviction choice. Imagining it like this, a very straightforward choice: should we recruit this potential candidate or not? Well, the beginning of the answer of that is, will they help us? Will they help us to achieve our vision for the future? Or are they just another person who's going to do some work for us? What is the vision? If you haven't really considered your vision for the future or some idea about how you're making the world better, the first thing to do as you click off this conversation is to think about, how is your work making the world a better place, and what does that look like? If it helps you, give yourself a 2 or 3 year time frame, longer if you can. How is your work making the world better? Personal values come into this too, because they really do inform our choices. In our work, we spend quite a bit of time with businesses helping them to understand their company values, which can be really quite fun because nearly invariably we come up with words like integrity. And words like integrity mean a multitude of different things to different people. It's your personal integrity, personal values as a leader that will inform your choices. In other words, will this choice ahead of me help move me towards, or help test, or help apply something of a personal value that's important to you? To expand on this, Dr. Matthew Anderson, who's a fellow at the University of Aberdeen, has done some brilliant work in what makes this whole idea of doing the right thing actually quite meaningful. Are there common threads about what doing the right thing actually might mean? In his research, in most scenarios, there are what he describes as some very consistent things about what doing the right thing actually means. And they're these. The first is to be of good character and ethically virtuous. So they're good character traits. In leadership thinking, that's often described as authentic leadership. Upholding truth and justice, just not telling lies, and being just in your choices. Being kind in the application of those choices, exercising honor, integrity, magnanimity, and defending the weak and powerless. These are some of the things that contribute towards doing the right thing. Now, as we're exploring and describing these scenarios in the context of a thought and a talk, you'll think, of course, these things make sense. But in fact, they can be quite hard to apply in our day-to-day lives. There's a further part that happens for a morally courageous leader around their values. They're able to consider variations in values and the purpose of a different perspective when achieving an outcome. So whilst my own values or your own values are the beginning of making a high conviction decision, the courageous leader will understand where other people are coming from and will know what the most important action or the most important purpose is. In other words, as a way of saying they're able to compromise when a decision is needed for the greater good. Are we pursuing a greater good here? So I personally might want to do X, Y, or Z, but I recognize that somebody in my team, despite approaching it from a different perspective, in fact, their approach is in this scenario better. Now that takes a word called humility. Rooted in values, rooted in vision and purpose, but requires some humility. So in other words, courage is neither reckless nor stubborn. I've got a few quite reckless and stubborn friends. In fact, I can think of some of my own scenarios where I have actually been quite reckless and thought it was courage. That's not courage in this context. That's simply recklessness, blazing on without a second thought or inviting other perspectives. Vision, purpose, values, and being prepared to invite other people into those scenarios. The British Army has a wonderful motto at Santos. It's called serve to lead. And that the idea of servant leadership is crucial because high conviction decisions just on their own can lead us down some quite destructive paths if we're not careful. I was trying to think of the most extreme example that I could. And in fact, a terrorist sprang to mind, and that they make choices with a high degree of conviction. They believe they're doing the right thing. But I'd argue not a lot of compassion at all. So high conviction without compassion is destructive. You could argue that the opposite is true too, that if it's all compassion, if it's all just heartfelt encouraging of others without bringing truth, that can be destructive too, if there's no choice in that compassion. So this blend of high conviction, this is the right thing to do with compassion, is crucial. And at this point, there are some gritty examples, aren't there? So we can think about in the maybe disturbing scenario where you might need to let some people go from your business, things are changing. The high conviction choice is just to do it and chop them out. The compassionate choice is to do it in the right way. And that might include giving them plenty of notice, ensuring that they're looked after for a few weeks or months or longer if they need to, making sure that some of the provision that the business has provided to them continues for a little while whilst they're searching for other work and so on. Not perhaps texting them that they've lost their job, but discussing with them some of the reasons why in person. That takes courage. It takes moral courage. There are many examples, I think, that you may be able to think of in your own leadership. You thought, I need to make a decision. That's courage. And I now need to make that decision with compassion. It's that idea of serving your people, serving others in your organization. High conviction decisions blended with compassion. It's worth a note here that compassion is not just empathy. Empathy is understanding where others are coming from, and that's a great start. But compassion is wanting to help them through difficult times, that sort of heartfelt need and desire to help others. Understanding is one thing, putting yourselves at risk for others is entirely another. So what can we do? What would we observe in leaders that create great conditions for moral courage? Well, we see this first and foremost, humility. Leaders that are prepared to be wrong bring courage and bring compassion and courage together into their organizations. We would see that as sharing credit, inviting perspectives, taking accountability when things don't go right, not blaming, not getting fiery and feisty when things aren't going wrong, but taking a humble approach, particularly to mistakes. We'd observe leaders that listen and genuinely listen. They're not just listening to respond, they're genuinely trying to understand other people's perspectives. They make time to listen. They don't rush from meeting to meeting or conversation to conversation and simply convey their own impressions and their own desires. They're listening. That listening would be with people. Sometimes the listening is wider than that. They're picking up signals from their organization and others, but they make time, they choose to listen. It's crucial for making morally courageous choices. In a morally courageous environment, a team or business will see a really healthy mutual regard for each other. It's not just bringing great people together into a team. There's a desire to draw out each other's best and help each other along the way. We heard this very recently in a team where somebody said, look, I expect to be called out by a colleague. And in fact, I would expect to do the same if we need to work on issues together. There's a mutual regard. We'd see, this is really important, we'd see complex and critical thinking in a morally courageous environment, because there's a deep desire to understand what the whole picture really is, even taking on board research and ideas and information that might be counter to a desire. So in other words, if things are going wrong, a morally courageous team want to understand that it's going wrong. They're not blind to it. They don't deny it. They don't push it away. They work on it well. There's a couple more. There's a strong focus, an extremely strong focus on the people that are served by the team, the business, or the organization. It's not just about the numbers. In fact, often the numbers are kind of in the background somewhere. They're there, but they're secondary to the people that are served by the organization. So self-interest, certainly in a leadership team setting, are secondary to the whole organization. And there's this wider idea. There's a sort of population, customer base, if you call it that are being served by the organization. And those people are prominent in thinking in a morally courageous environment. For example, employees are not just numbers, they are people to a morally courageous team. And the last condition, or the last observation that we'd make of morally courageous teams, is there's quite a bit of joy, not just fun, but there's a kind of joy in leadership. There's a desire to lead, to go through those more sweaty moments, pushing through some difficult decisions, but doing so knowing that the colleagues are around you, and that you're doing it with great intentions and achieving a purpose and an objective that is really valuable. In other words, not being seduced by the immediate short-term decisions, but thinking beyond the immediate impact and the immediate consequences to something, in fact, that should be better far off. So if there's a bit of drama for a month or two, whilst a good morally courageous leader will engage with that to some extent, they see it as simply and perhaps profoundly a test towards something far better. They're not sucked into the immediate. And that can be a joyful place to be. So humility, listening, mutual regard, complex and critical thinking, a really strong focus on the people. These are things that we encourage in the organizations in which we work, and some joy in leadership. So think about how you can be a morally courageous leader, decide with conviction, and implement those decisions with compassion.